Hi, my name is Mike Wilson, and I'm part of the subcommittee from the center that helped put together the speaker series. Before I introduce our tonight's speaker, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. What's a land acknowledgement, you may ask? Despite the myths, the Western Hemisphere was populated by more than 100 million human beings prior to European intrusion. The land you stand on was inhabited by people who had been in those regions for centuries. For those outside of Charlottesville, it may be an opportunity to find out who the original people were, which nation, tribe that predated Euro-Americans. Here's the land acknowledgement. I am present just outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, the land that was traditionally that of the Monacan Nation. They cared for these lands as the lands cared for them. The bones of their ancestors are buried in these lands. I ask you to take a moment and consider all of this. Thank you. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Kasey Jernigan, who is a professor, assistant professor at the University of Virginia. She's also a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Tonight, she will offer an overview of Indigenous peoples, pre-European contact, and more immediate impacts of those contacts, focused on what is now known as Virginia and the southeast seaboard. Thank you very much. Kasey Jernigan, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was a really nice introduction. I am just going to share my screen. Okay. Is that looking okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Halito sa hochifo yat Kasey Jernigan, chata ahoyo siya hoke, katyam atokma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, yatali, Charlottesville, Virginia, amitile, chi afama li katsana yokpa. I just said in Chata Anumpa, hi, good evening. I'm Kasey Jernigan, I'm Choctaw. I come from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the Choctaw Nation, but I'm living in what is currently known as Charlottesville, Virginia. And I'm really excited to be here today, meeting with all of you. Yakoke, thank you for welcoming me here. As Mike mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in anthropology and in American Studies at UVA, and I was incredibly honored when Mike and Mary Wilson, who are pillars of the center and the community, invited me to participate in this series. So Yakoke, Mike, and Mary, who have become like family to me and my children here, as well as the Indigenous students at UVA. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity because we are taught how important and central elders are in our communities. They are our knowledge holders, our knowledge keepers, and Mike and Mary have accepted that role very graciously, and they continue to make themselves available to guide us, teach us, and remind us through example how to be good relatives. So Mike gave a really beautiful land acknowledgement, and I too had prepared one as well. What you see on the screen is the one that was created in collaboration with the Monacan Nation. But I also like to add that for myself as a Choctaw Ahoyo, a Choctaw woman, a scholar, a teacher, my own practice of land acknowledgement is as much about the recognition of these ancient relationships of friendship, of kinship and alliance between our Indigenous nations, as much as it is about recognizing the fact that land was seized through one means or another during the expansion of settler colonialism. We must, and we indeed are, rebuilding and renewing these relations as we struggle together for decolonizations and the resurgence of traditional culture and the return of Indigenous lands. This matters because the past, the present, and the future demand of us more than just performative practices. And this must be backed up by action. Otherwise, it risks becoming a taunt of sorts, right? So Cherokee scholar Joseph Pierce recently tweeted that land acknowledgements are almost like announcing, hey, this used to be your land, but now it's ours. And so they risk becoming empty gestures. But here at U of VA, there's this large collective of, or growing collective of students, faculty, staff, and Indigenous community members like Mike and Mary, who are working to make substantive steps towards this. So, for example, we created just this past year the first Native American Indigenous Studies minor program. We are currently developing a tribal consultation policy between UVA and the 7 federally recognized nations in Virginia. We're also advocating fiercely for a tribal liaison and collaborating with the Monacan Indian Nation on projects that are meaningful and important to them first and foremost. And within an Indigenous framework of centering how to be good ancestors, we're working towards building a robust and inclusive Native American Global Indigenous Center and intellectual community for students, for faculty, staff, and community members. And I am linking in the chat right now. Let me see if I can get this set up. I'm linking a digital map. It's a feature that's available. And I invite you to learn more about the lands that you inhabit, be it Charlottesville or elsewhere. To learn about these lands, about the history of those lands, how to actively be part of a better future going forward together. So when I was asked to participate in this lecture series, I was asked to talk about Indigenous peoples pre-contact. And as I thought about what to focus on, I knew that I didn't want this to be just an overview of what you likely already learned, or perhaps all that you know about Indigenous peoples in North America. And that would be, information about history or removal or some of our ancestral practices, material culture or documented stories or belief systems, things like that. I wanted this talk to be something that was very likely new to you or interesting and even a bit challenging for you to think about. So I thought about something that is rarely, if ever, taught in US schools or included in education curriculum. And I thought that we could journey through particular landscapes nearby as they can be known or imagined pre-contact, and as a way to understand the peoples in this space and this place and their relations with other living beings. And this can be challenging to consider. These are our land-based stories and ways of relating. It's challenging not in the sense that it's hard to understand. No, it's not. It's not hard to understand intellectually that Indigenous worldviews are different and do not practice human exceptionalism. I think instead it's the ask that can be challenging. And the ask is that you take seriously Indigenous worldviews that have been dismissed as unrealistic, as unintelligent, uncivilized, unimportant, primitive, folklore, mythology, and so on. And so tonight I invite you to be open-minded and to consider Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of being pre-contact and still present today. And I ask this because colonization is not only an attack on peoples and their lands, but it is an attack that is made possible in part through intentional misrepresentations of Indigenous cosmologies, whereby Indigenous understandings and teachings of the world are often viewed as mythic. And our stories and our teachings are considered as alternative modes of understanding and interpretation rather than real events. And I focus on this because it very much provides context for the traumatic experiences post-contact that have shaped contemporary experiences and the many forms of erasure for Indigenous peoples. So these are pictures of my family when I was young, and we all understand that we are all biased and that who does the telling or who is speaking, it matters greatly. Our identities, our experiences, our positionalities all affect how we view and understand the world. So I want to articulate my own social location. That's to say that I think it matters that I share a bit of my own family story so that you can situate me and how I make sense of what I'm sharing with you. I am a second generation Indian boarding school survivor. This is my grandmother right here in this picture, my pokmi, that's the Choctaw word for grandmother. And she and my auntie, her sister, they were forced to attend Shalako, which was an agricultural school, a boarding school that was more than 200 miles away from their home and their family. And Shalako, like other boarding schools or residential schools, was known for its highly structured and strict sort of military regime. And it was meant not as an educational experience, but rather a tool of assimilation. And so my pokni was not allowed to speak Chata Anumpa, the language. She could only speak English, and they were forced into Christianity and so on. And so they had profoundly difficult, horrible experiences there, experiences that were related to these assimilation practices that carried forward through generations. And when I was a kid, this age and growing up, my pokni shared a bedroom with my younger sister, who's there. You can see her hugging, and this is me and my dad and my mom and my other sister and my other grandma. Well, my pokni, she lived with us and she shared a bedroom with my younger sister, Megan, and me. And we had 2 beds in that room, but my sister and I would always find our way to Pokni's bed, and we would cuddle up close to her as she shared stories with us. And these are some of my most favorite memories because she shared so openly with us. Our parents weren't around to shush us from asking difficult questions. And so she told us stories about Shalako, about the school, how she and Auntie tried to run away at night. They would pack little handkerchiefs full of food that they had saved, and they were always caught and sent back. And so she told us these stories. She told us how when they made it back home, back to Atoka and Durant, where they grew up, how their land and their family home, everything that they had known had been stolen and had been occupied by a local family. She told me about how their other family members had been dispersed or had passed away or had been institutionalized. So she taught us at those very young ages, through her own experiences, how all of this erasure and disenfranchisement was made possible, how it happened. But she also shared other very important stories with us about who we are. She shared Choctaw teachings with us through stories. And we have lots of stories that are sacred and they're not to be shared, but we have other stories that are told, and they're meant to be shared because they carry meaningful information about the worlds that we all share. And so today I will be sharing with you one such story, and I'm linking it with the theme of this talk, Indigenous cosmologies. And I will remind you about stories, how they're alive, how stories, if we remember to think about stories as living beings, we can understand the many ways that stories grow, how they develop, how they change, not necessarily in their essence, right? But maybe in their details. We can remember that stories are shaped by the land, by the culture, by the person telling the story, by the audience. So one story may be told widely, it may be shared often, and it may change just slightly every time it gets told. So it is with the story that I will share with you today. It's a Choctaw story, and it's just one version of the story, and I'm only going to share part of it with you. So my people, the Choctaws, we come from the southeastern part of the United States, and you can see that here. I've zoomed it in here. See Choctaw, Yakni, Choctaw right here. And so we come from the area that is largely known as Mississippi. And so it's not too far from here, from Virginia. And in the early 1800s, our people ceded more than 23 million acres of land to the United States, and Choctaws were then removed out to the west to what is currently known as Oklahoma. And we were the first tribe to be removed by the federal government, but some of our ancestors refused removal and stayed behind. And so we have two nations. We have the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and we also have the Mississippi Band of Choctaws. And linguists will tell us that our language is endangered. That's true in part, but it still very much exists. And in one place where you will find it is in place names or markings of the land. So both the places that we used to live and where many of us continue to live, and in places that you will even recognize. For example, Misa Sapokni. So I'm wondering if anyone can think about what Misa Sapokni might be. When settlers arrived, they asked, what is this river called? And our people told them, Misa Sapokni, Sapokni meaning old. So older than time or without beginning is Misa Sapokni. And the settlers said, oh, okay, the Mississippi River then. So Misa Sapokni became Mississippi. Same with Oklahoma. Hama meaning red, Okla meaning people. So the state is, when it became a state, it was named Oklahoma, the red people. And if you go even farther back in time, pre-contact, we had earth workers, and we don't really know what they were called, that their names or who they were, that has been lost. But we know that they would push the earth up and out into the four directions. They would create these types of mounds with sort of flat tops. And these were our mound builders. And they were really important because our people believed that the cosmos had three distinct pieces. You had the upper world where winged beings lived, right? So birds and bats and anything that can fly and so on, as well as our deities like Hashtali, the sun, father sun. Then you have the middle world where people, where humans, plants, animals, rivers, and water beings lived. And then you had the third world, which was the underworld. And this is where our water panther lived, thrashing its tail to make these sort of whirlpool-like motions that would suck people in. And the underworld also included animals and creatures, beings, living beings like alligators and snakes. These are the kinds of beings that can disappear into the dark water underground. And what our ancestors understood was that the middle world, the earth, it didn't move. It was the one piece that stayed stable. But the upper world and the underworld, they would rotate. They would rotate around the earth, so that when the upper world rotated down, it would take the sunshine with it. The sun would disappear. And likewise, when the underworld rotated up, it would bring with it the moon and the stars, the constellations. And so these mound builders, the earth people, they would look up at the constellations and they would see there that there were sacred bundles created by the stars. And they understood these constellations, these sacred bundles, as important, and knew that they had to be recreated here on earth. So a spiritual person, a medicine person would roll out a hide and put in special items, sacred items that would recreate what they were seeing in the sky. And they would roll up these bundles very tightly, tie them up and care for them, treating them as living beings, as living things. And they would teach other medicine people how to do this work so that that knowledge could be carried forward. And the teachings and the care for the bundles could be carried forward. Because these bundles were thought to be very important, they were understood as this link between the upper world and the middle world, kind of like an umbilical cord. And it would connect the two. And it was very important that we remained tethered to the upper world, because they understood that we were originally star people, and they recognized other star people in the constellations as well. And there are many, many mounds all over, but I'm going to tell you about one, the one that is the most sacred to Choctaws, the most important for us. And this mound is called Nonaweya, and it is in Misasapokni, Mississippi. And this site is really important and sacred to us because when medicine people would look up at the sky at night, they would see a portal, a constellation that looked like two rattlesnakes tied together. And most of the year, that space in between the portal was empty. But as the sky changes, as the worlds rotate, the portal becomes full. And you may know this constellation as Orion, the archer, right? But our medicine people recognize this constellation as a hand. And if you start with the 3 stars, which are Orion's belt, so you have the 3 stars here, they make the wrist. You can see it right there. They make the wrist. And if you go down, you'll find the 5 fingers. And right in the center of that, you have the palm. And you'll see a nebula, as scientists call it. But the medicine people recognized that as an eye. And this is an interpretation of that. This is the palm and the eye. And late at night, they would look up and they would see souls returning through that eye. And they were going back to the star people. And the medicine people knew that we were star people because when you see that the world is turning, when the upper world goes down and the underworld comes up, as the places are being changed, when the underworld is going back to its place, sometimes it would bump across the middle world, the earthen plateau, right? And when this would happen, when the underworld would bump against the middle world, during these changes, a star person would get stuck there. And eventually, a lot of star people got trapped in there in the ground, and it was miserable. It was dark and wet, and they were all squished together, and they were cramped, and it was just miserable. So they called out to Creator to help them. And Hashtali, Creator, helped, and Creator heard them and saw how they were trapped and how they were cramped and how miserable they were. And Creator reached into the ground and pushed up the first mound. And this is believed to be Nanaweya. And it's still there today. And it's a sacred site, right? Because that's where star people entered the earth. It's where star people were pushed up through the mound, through Nanaweya, and they came out like ants almost, but they were wet and they were muddy and they were covered in these cocoon-like sheaths. And so they lay out on the mound, on the earth, and they dried. The sun dried them. And when they were dry and ready, they began to walk across the lands. And that is how humans came from the skies, from the stars to the middle ground, to earth. And when you would die, your people would bring your body back to the mound, because that is how you would get back to the stars. The portal would carry you back to the mound because the portal would carry you back to the stars when the time was right. And that's in October, right? When the portal opens. And the medicine people would perform the ceremonies, and they would release all the star people through the portal, where they would meet what you would know as the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper. But the mound people, the medicine people, knew these as canoes that would ferry souls across back to the other stars. And I think that I'll stop right there with that story, because that's a lot to think about. And my point is to introduce you to a story, right? We are hardwired for story. If you think about stories, and I talked earlier about my Pokni sharing stories with me and my sisters, we remember stories. We fill in between the lines in ways that stories leave us open to create relationships with a narrative, right? And stories are a way of weaving relationships. Stories embrace the intellect, the physical sense, the emotion, and spirit. Stories are so holistic. And we remember in these powerful ways because each part of our being has been touched. And one of the biggest problems that we face today is environmental, the climate crisis. And we definitely need to approach this with restoration, with ecological restoration for sure. But there's also this movement happening right now towards restoration, which is to say that we need to tell ourselves a different story about our relationships to place. That's where creation stories come in, right? Either stories from our ancestors or the ones that we are in the process of creating today about our relationship to place. These really matter. They can become a map for us, instructions or a compass even. So you may be familiar with the story of Sky Woman. It's a Haudenosaunee creation story. And there are several versions of the story, but the essence of that story is that long before the world was created, there was an island in the sky that was inhabited by sky people. And one day, a pregnant sky woman dropped through a hole and began to fall for what seemed like eternity. And coming out of the darkness, she eventually sees water. And the animals from this world all come together, and they're trying to understand what they see in the sky. So a flock of birds is sent to help her, and the birds catch her, and they gently guide her down to the back of a great turtle. And then the water animals like otter and beaver, they've prepared a place for her on the back of the turtle. and they bring mud from the bottom of the ocean and they place it on turtle's back until solid earth begins to form and to grow, increase in size. And so turtle's back becomes Sky Woman's home. And the plants that she brings with her, the plants that she's brought down from Sky World, like tobacco and strawberries, they become her medicine. And she makes a life for herself and becomes the mother of Haudenosaunee life as we know it today. So I share this story because Sky Woman and the mound builders, these are creation stories that make up part of Indigenous cosmologies, which are the sources of identity and orientation to the world. These stories not only tell us who we are, right, but they offer original instructions or compass or a way, direction, right, teachings for a way of being in the world. And many of you may be familiar with Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, and specifically her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to read it or give it a listen on Audible. I think she narrates it herself, and it's just incredibly beautiful. It's just such a great book. And one of my favorite parts of that book is right at the beginning when she compares Sky Woman falling with the story of Adam and Eve. So she compares, she challenges us to think about Sky Woman's story, how it leads to the generous embrace of the living world, right? While the other, Eve's story, leads to basically banishment. And if we think about that, if we consider that a little bit deeper, we see that in the Christian creation story. We see how that interaction between Eve and the other than humans, the serpent, the tree of knowledge, the apple. We see how those interactions led to this damnation of all future humankind, right? It also meant that the garden where they were living, right? They were living inside that garden, quickly became a place where humans were cast out, banished. They were no longer of their surroundings, but outside of them. And if this creation story has many consequences for the ways that we view the world, but there are two significant ones that I think are important to talk about and consider in relation to Indigenous cosmologies. And the first is that humans were positioned in this story, they were positioned into a world in which they were able to reside over nature, right? A hierarchy was created with humans at the top and all other beings below. And secondly, interdependently, humans concluded that being in relation with nature had disastrous, even dangerous consequences, right? Effects. So nature being the tree of knowledge, the serpent. And so this sort of relationality between species became incredibly limited, if not profane. So in this worldview, human to human interactions are central. Societies were built upon dominating nature, right? The domination over nature because of a perception that human relations with other than human worlds was unnecessary or even dangerous. But if we consider an Indigenous perspective, the same interaction between humans and non-humans has different results, right? So for many Indigenous peoples, being aligned with the other than human or the more than human world it's a position that was treated with respect. And you'll note that in these two creation stories, that I shared with you tonight, the mound builders and sky woman, that humans were the last to arrive to Earth, right? And this is central to these stories because it also means that humans arrived in a state of dependence on an already functioning world that already had particular values, particular ethics, and so on. And including humans into this world meant that certain arrangements and certain agreements, relations, had to be made with the other than human worlds. So I share these with you today because I like to think about, or I ask you to consider, what if we could re-story our relation to place in these ways today? Like, what if we considered the humanity of living on the landscape in relation to the land, to the waters, plants, animals, expanding the experience of a place? If you think about it, we live in a particularly indigenous world. It's a world that is infused with story, with memory, with histories that created it. And indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world have the capacity to move us, to force us to really examine our assumptions about what it is that actually makes up this world and the roles that we play in this world, our responsibilities, our gifts. Pre-contact, our ancestors recognized that every being has a gift. Humans have gifts, plants have gifts, water has a gift. And despite attempts by the settler state and its agents to eliminate indigenous knowledges and livelihoods, this knowledge still persists. It's still around because it's embodied and it's practiced collectively. And this is part of what Hockney taught my sisters and me, all those stories that she shared with us at bedtime every night. She reminded us, she taught us that each of us has a gift, but that gift and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. So when we think about what gift we have, and each one of us has a gift, right? It's all different. As a scholar, as an elder, as an artist, as a teacher, as a gardener, whatever your gift is, you're called upon to give it in return, right? It's your responsibility to give in return for everything that you've been given. And so these knowledges, the act of sharing these stories and ways of knowing and being, so that the power and the importance of indigenous knowledge is possibly recognized or discovered or acknowledged or something today. I share this because I believe that this is an act of both futurity as well as resistance, because it marks this type of knowledge as important and meaningful right now in the moment, but also in the future. So to speculate about the future, how we want our communities, I meant to share this, by the way, how we want our communities to grow and thrive going forward, and how do we get there? It matters. It's important to understand how indigenous knowledge is produced, and then to think about the ways that it can counter and decolonize settler colonial knowledge. And so I will wrap up with a thought. What if we could apply indigenous ways of knowing and being, indigenous relationality, reciprocity today? What could our worlds look like? What could our worlds be like? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kasey. I don't know about everybody else, but I have a lot to process there. Those stories are very vast. We have a few questions and comments, so I'll start with those. Thank you all for saying that. So Angela said, thank you. The creation story was very enlightening. What about the use of red ochre in burial? She wanted to know if you knew anything about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know much about it. This is not really my specialty, to be completely honest with you. I'm sorry.
That's
I just
okay.
don't know.
Dr. Adams asked, is there any systemic way that these stories are being preserved for today's grandchildren and everyone?
That is such a great question. And I think that it challenges us to think about preservation, right? It challenges us to ask first of all, what type of stories are being preserved and what does preservation look like? So if we think about the dominant discourse of heritage, certain types of stories and certain types of heritage are privileged and preserved, and they don't include Indigenous stories very often. They include, here at UVA, the academical village, the rotunda, those kinds of things, right? The stories of Thomas Jefferson. They rarely include Indigenous peoples. In fact, something that I've been doing at UVA since I arrived here is I'm starting this new project where when I became a new faculty member, I went on an orientation tour of the grounds. And it was one of those new tours that offered a very honest sort of tour of UVA and grounds, and really grappled with the histories of enslaved people, and showed different sites of importance. And it was a really honest, difficult tour, but it was very much this black-white dichotomy. And so I asked our tour guides about the Indigenous peoples, and I was curious, what about, like, whose land are we on? Do you know? Like, what are some of the stories? And they didn't know anything. And so that tells you a lot. And so one of the projects that I've started is thinking about how to restore UVA from Indigenous perspectives. What are some of the sites on grounds in Charlottesville, in Virginia, in the region more broadly that are Indigenous, that demand to be told? And when they're told, what kind of work can that do? And so this project is a digital storytelling project with tribal citizens in Virginia and North Carolina. And it is an opportunity to tell stories of land, of space, place, and to offer a way to preserve some of those stories, to bring them forward and record them, not just for us, right, but for Indigenous communities themselves. If I didn't have my grandma poke me telling me these stories, I likely wouldn't know, right? And so not everybody has a grandma that can tell stories. Part of the assimilation process was erasing, right? Erasing those stories, erasing those knowledges, erasing that. And so, yeah, it's very important to preserve those in one way or another. But it demands then that we ask ourselves how to preserve them, in what ways, especially some of the stories that are sacred and not meant to be shared. Yeah.
Several people commented that Braiding Sweetgrass is a wonderful book, and that they should really, someone said, listen to the Audible version. Her voice and timing are incredible. So
I agree. It's beautiful. And she also has another book. I have it on my bookshelf. Something about moss. Does anybody know? Does anybody wear the moss? I can't remember. Something about moss, and that is just incredibly as beautiful as Braiding Sweetgrass. So if you're looking for more of her work, that's such a great book as well.
Jan Dix also commented when you were speaking about you know, the sense of place and things having a story, everything. She said, I love that about Ireland, that every mountain and river and place has a story. It's tragic to me that those stories about where we live have been lost or destroyed.
Yeah, that's, it's really interesting. Yes, every place has a story, and even non-Indigenous peoples have stories, right? Our ancestors have stories, and there's a really interesting connection between Choctaws and Irish people. Right after removal, after our nation was removed to what is now Oklahoma, the potato famine hit. This was 1830s, right? And so the Choctaw people did sort of like the 1830s version of GoFundMe, right? They collected money and sent something like $750, which I don't even know the equivalent in today's money, but it was a huge amount of money, sent it over to Ireland. And if you just think about that for a moment, the people who had just been removed and were starting over and, wrestling with these upheavals, these intense upheavals and violence, and the thousands and thousands of deaths of people who had to walk those many thousands of miles during one of the worst winters ever, to come together and recognize this pain, this famine in folks that they never even met, right? Way over in Ireland, and to donate money that they didn't even have. So there's this really interesting and beautiful connection between Choctaws and Ireland. And there's actually a monument that the Irish erected. It's this feather, really beautiful feather. I feel like I'm saying beautiful a lot tonight, but it's this feather monument that acknowledges that relationship and that gift.
That's a story I've never heard. I don't know about anybody else, but that is certainly one worth, that's amazing. Sorry, I'm getting choked up. Gathering Moss is the name of the book that you were trying to think of, I believe.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Vaneda said, we moved here from the Pacific Northwest 4 years ago and first went to the Monacan Reservation. We were shocked at the small size and lack of resources for the natives. What can we do to become involved in the community? We are, excuse me, I'm not going to get this right, Hunkpapa Sioux? We are Hunkpapa Sioux.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mike's nodding like I didn't do too bad.
So another great question. These are all really excellent comments and questions. And so Virginia has a really interesting, particular history, right? And that's, it's unique to the area, and the experience being one of the first sort of contact points of invasion, right? And a particular history of the Racial Integrity Act, right, of 1924, that basically created two races of people, white and Black. And anybody who was Native or Indigenous or anything else was put into the Black racial category, and literally paper genocide happened. So people would go back into records at the Vital Statistics Records Department and recheck or rewrite the race of people, so that you were no longer Indian, or you were no longer Native or Monacan, you were Black. And so you can think about the consequences of something like that, how that would affect recognition, how that erased Native people. And so then you can think about how the Monacan Nation today really, really struggled to get recognized, get federal recognition, because of this very particular history of the Racial Integrity Act. And you can see it in things like the size of the nation, the resources that they have. But with federal recognition comes more opportunities. So they are incredibly hardworking right now to rebuild their nation. They've got fabulous people doing really good work, and it's an exciting moment for them, for sure. In terms of what you can do to become involved in the community, I think it matters that you know how to be a good ally, right? You know how to step back when you need to, and offer support and help when it's needed. Contact the nation and see what they need. But sometimes don't, right? Because sometimes they're overwhelmed. There's a lot happening in our world right now. COVID, a lot of tribes are struggling with COVID and getting resources and medicine and help for citizens. And so, that's a really difficult question to answer for me. But I think, one of the reasons we are so fiercely advocating for a tribal liaison here at UVA is because the tribes have expressed to us that they are overwhelmed with requests. Requests from faculty on participating in research and doing things for projects, but also from other, people who are super well-meaning and have good intentions and want to help out. They're just incredibly overwhelmed. And so we came up with the idea of having this tribal liaison who could connect the tribes with the university so that there can be a central person that sort of navigates that, right? Does the negotiation so that tribes aren't constantly fielding questions and being asked to do things, being burdened in those ways. Yes, Mary, thank you. Yes, the support of their food bank is one really important way to help. They have a great food bank there. So that's a great way.
Judith Fox said, I went to Beloit, I might mess that title too, college in Wisconsin, where the campus is built around the turtle mounds. I understood these were built by Native Americans. In your creation story, the mound is just always there. It's not created by humans. Is that correct?
So in our creation story, the mound was created by the Nanaweya. That particular mound was created by a creator. Other mounds, though, were built by mound builders. So in Wisconsin it has its own stories, right? The people there have their own creation stories and their own stories related to the mounds. I just shared with you the one about Nanaweya, which was told to me as creator pushing it forth so that the star people could emerge.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Orbs wrote, you're beautiful, both on the outside and in your soul. Thanks for this. I have a distinct interest in and desire to learn much more about Indigenous peoples, so this is a good personal insight you've shared. Blessings on you and your family and nation. Thank you. That's incredibly sweet. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining tonight and for your thoughtful questions. It's really, really meaningful. Oh, also, I think someone, Faye Miller said the monument, I believe it's the feather you were talking about with Ireland. I believe that's when her comment came in, was pictured on Bing.com yesterday or the day before. So. Oh, cool. Yeah, I think if you Google Choctaw and Ireland connection, that monument will come up, and it's worth looking at. It's really pretty. Peggy's listed, there's 11 federally recognized tribes in Wisconsin. Each has its own creation story. Yeah. So that's another thing that is worth mentioning, is that there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone. On top of that, there are numerous state recognized tribes. And then there are tribes that have neither federal or state recognition. And that's a very fraught subject, but the point is that
part of what colonization has done is created this sort of monolith of all Native peoples, right? That we're all just Native American, one Indigenous peoples. But the truth is that we are all so diverse. And as Margaret mentioned, just among the 11 federally recognized tribes in Wisconsin, they each have their own creation story. You can imagine the many creation stories of the 574 federally recognized tribes. It's vast.
Paul says, asks the question, isn't the Bible also a creation story?
Yes, and that I think is the point that Robin Wall Kimmerer makes, right? In her book, she compares the two creation stories and makes the distinction between what they mean for worldviews, right? So on the one hand, in the Bible, the creation story of Adam and Eve, you have Eve and humankind who are banished and are not in relation with the earth, with the land, with the beings. Whereas in Indigenous creation stories, the two that I shared with you tonight, it's a different worldview in which humans are in relation with other living beings, and there's no hierarchy, right? This is the land, this is the place in which we live and we be, right? Whereas in the Bible creation story, earth is a temporary resting spot until you can make it to heaven, right? Or hell, or wherever. So there are some similarities, but there are also some really important distinctions, which have real life consequences in how you think about land, how you think about living beings, how you think about your relationship to the earth, right?
Personally, that's, I think, what I'm going to take home the most is that huge difference there. That's really something I have never really thought about. So thank you. Bill asks, could you comment on the relationship and history of the, I believe he's Monicans and Amherst, and I believe I don't know if it's Manahoiks or if it's Monicans. It might be a typo, in Orange and Madison County.
Yeah, I don't really know much. Is it the Mana? Yeah, I really don't know much about that. I'm still new to the area and I'm still learning about all of the different tribal peoples and nations and their histories. I think that the Monacan Nation has a really great website and a museum, an ancestral museum that has a lot of information. And it's a great place. If you get a chance, you should definitely go out to Amherst and visit it. I'm sure that could help clear up some of those questions. I'm still learning myself. Yeah.
Great suggestion. Lots of thank you. Someone had to leave and said, great presentation. Kasey, you are a treasure in our community. We thank you so much for being here with us, for opening us up for teaching. You make your grandma proud. I guess you know who that's from.
Thank you, Mary. Yakoke. Well, this was truly an honor, and I really enjoyed seeing so many faces and thinking about some of these really good questions. Thank you so much for inviting me, for spending your evening with me, and for thinking about things with me.
That's lovely. Well, thank you for being here. Any other questions? I'll put up the poll as well, or the survey, if you don't mind filling that out, folks. That would be really helpful to us. But please keep things coming. So here's a question from Richard. You showed us a map showing which Native peoples lived in the area, Monacan. Did other Indigenous peoples live here previous to the Monacan?
I'm just going to pull up that map again. There's the map that I shared in the chat does a really good job of of showing you who lived where. So I'm pulling up Charlottesville right now, and it shows that we are on, it's zoomed in hyper. It shows that we are on Monacan land and nearby the Manahoic, which is what somebody was asking about earlier. And you can zoom out and you can see, you know, there are different regions, but as we all know that Indigenous peoples are and were not and still are not stagnant, right? We move, right? We move constantly. I'm from Oklahoma and came here by way of Massachusetts. Now I'm here. And so to think that only the Monacan have been here is likely not a complete picture. There likely have been other peoples here, and will continue to be other peoples here, yet this is Monacan land, this is Indigenous land, and it always has been and it always will be, right? And the Monacan people are worth celebrating. They have stewarded the land up until the moment we are all here. So it's worth acknowledging them for sure.
And that link you put, or the link to that wonderful map resource, we're going to send everybody who registered a link with certain maps of Indigenous peoples in Virginia over time and the United States, as well as that link, so that folks can play with that. It's really fascinating tool. We'll also send out a notice on how to be a good ally, some steps you can take. Someone asked that question. And also a great bibliography that Mike and Mary Wilson put together of books that you might want to read. So that'll be coming to you along with the link to this recording that you feel free to share once we upload it to our YouTube website. So stay tuned for that. Someone said, interesting, but not what I was expecting. I learned some things, and Dr. Jernigan is a very engaging lecturer.
Thank you. That's great.
It is. It's a great comment. I agree with it too. Virginia says loss of language is primarily due to lack of usage, and it is a very slow process. Many languages have been, and many others are in the process worldwide. So.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting that when we're told that our languages are endangered, it's not entirely accurate. And it also, it's endangered from certain perspectives, but it also gives the idea that they're going extinct. And to say something is extinct is very problematic for Indigenous peoples because that's been part of the narrative, that's been part of the tool of erasure, is to claim that we are not here. And that's the heart of settler colonialism, right? It's its own kind of colonialism. It's not like colonialism in South Africa or India, for example, where the British came in India and controlled the people and the resources and left, right? Largely left while still maintaining control. It's a different, settler colonialism is different because the British came and they never left. And their goal wasn't to control from afar. The goal was to get rid of the Indigenous peoples, to erase and eliminate in one way or another, so that the land and the resources could then be taken, right? And so that has very specific outcomes or consequences for Indigenous peoples, in that we've been, part of the narrative is to erase us and to say that we are going extinct. And that was indeed like part of what happened with, collecting voices or collecting stories, and Edward Curtis and his pictures of Indians, right? The Stoic Indians, those kinds of things. It was part of this narrative that Indians were disappearing at vast rates. And it's, I see this in my classes today. I teach Native Studies at UVA, and I have students who come in and they know nothing. They think that there are no Native peoples on the eastern seaboard, that all Native peoples were either relocated out to reservations in the West or dead. And they just have no knowledge. And so I find myself having to unteach a lot of the things that they have learned. And I spend a lot of time on contemporary issues, right? Contemporary presence, making visible Native peoples in the moment. And that's what they're really interested in. I mean, they react in really interesting ways too. They'll say things like, why didn't we learn this? Or they'll get really angry, like, why is this not taught? Or they'll get really sad. It's quite an experience to teach people, to teach these students today. It's really quite an experience.
Mike, if you want to chime in, I'm sure happy to have you say anything. Also, someone asked, any thoughts on Gayhead, Narragansett people and Choctaw?
On the Narragansett people and Gayhead and Choctaw, I don't know that relationship. I don't have anything to add. Maybe if Roberta wants to give a little information about that. I don't know that relationship.
Okay. Well, I know Berta and I have your email. So if Berta, you can't articulate it here, no worries. We'll ask Kasey at another time if that's okay. Mike, did you want to?
Yeah, one of the things that I put up on the chat was the fact that in Virginia there were 3 base language groups. There was the Monacan, who had Siouan language. There was Narragansett, and then there was, and I'm doing a great space job right now. Help me.
I think Lucy will.
Algonquin. It was Algonquin. Yeah. And the flow of the nations have always been huge. Everything that I've learned is like the valley. The Shenandoah Valley was just a throughway, and not a whole lot of people stayed there because everybody was using it on their north-south trips. Trade routes were incredible through the country. So, the idea that people were just a little stagnant, like they were in Europe, was a huge misconception.
I unmuted Lucy. Lucy, if you want to comment too, you're more than welcome.
Thank you, Kasey. That was great fun. I really enjoyed that. Mary and Michael as well. Well, Michael was right about the Siouan tribes of the Piedmont and Algonquin speakers more at the coast. And I do know that there were also some evidence, I think, for Iroquois speakers, as well as there might have been 4. I don't know. I think the general discussion was 3 some years ago, but there were, I think, some Tuscarora, and I'm not really sure if they're Algonquin speakers. They may be. So it was quite diverse in this region, this whole region that we're talking about, that's very fluid, as Michael said.
Thanks, Lucy.
And we'll hear more from Lucy next week. Lucy will be our next speaker. So thank you for joining us tonight too, Lucy, and giving us a little preview.
We are all we're all close, so we're accustomed to talking together quite a bit. So I'm very happy to be here with the people I'm closest to.
Lovely. Anyone else? Jim Hasmer put a book that I think spoke to him, First People of Virginia by Keith Egloff and Deborah Woodard, covers from 9,500 BC on, which just that statement in and of itself is so much information we never got taught in school. That 9,500 BC, you know, it was just never something we thought about. Anyone else before we say goodbye and thank you to Dr. Jernigan? Okay, well, we thank you very much. And as many people have said, you've given us so much to think about. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Mike, and everyone else.
Thank you so much for inviting me here and for sharing your time on a cold Wednesday evening. It really means a lot, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some of my stories and to just be with you all. What a great center. Yeah, thank you.
All right, I see Mary. Mary, I thought I unmuted you. Sorry. All right, I'm going to turn off the recording.